Hello, the topic of this lecture is on the topics of compatibilism and of free will. That is, whether the concept of free will, whatever that ends up being, is compatible with our definitions of determinism or indeterminism that we talked about earlier in the text and in the previous lecture. So the first thing to ask about compatibilism is what compatible with what? Our text sort of seems to regard compatibilism as one view, or kind of makes it sound like it's one view, and it's not. That's not really the case. Compatibilism is lots of views. That is, there are lots of compatibilist views, and in order to tell them apart, you have to say, okay, so who is saying what is compatible with what, right? So again, if somebody walked up to you on the street and said the word compatible, right, you'd say, what is what, or they say, is it compatible? You say, is what compatible with what, right? So again, the word compatible requires those other two things. And so the kinds of issues that we'll be talking about in this part of the text, this part of the course, are the questions: is free will compatible with determinism? That's one question we'll take a look at. It's a major one. Is free will compatible with indeterminism? The text very briefly mentions that that's an issue, but doesn't really go into it as much as it should. We'll go into it a little bit more here. Is moral responsibility compatible with determinism? The text spends a lot of time on that issue. And the text spends less time, though again, we'll spend some more time asking the question, is moral responsibility compatible with indeterminism? And so there are various kinds of things that could be compatible with what? So either free will is compatible with determinism, or free will is compatible with indeterminism, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when we think about compatibilism, think probably compatibilisms rather than it just being one view. And just to put some confusion to rest, there are some views that are named in the text that I just want to be clear what those views entail. And so the view that the text will sometimes refer to as quote unquote hard determinism, those who hold this view, it's really a combination between two different views. Number one, hard determinists tend to accept determinism. They tend to assume that it's probably the case, and the reason that they do that is probably in most cases to adopt a kind of scientific worldview. A scientific worldview does tend to be a deterministic one. And in addition to accepting determinism, again, this is different than saying that they have some evidence that it's actually true. Again, we covered it in the last lecture why nobody has such evidence as to why either determinism or indeterminism could ever be true. I mean, one of them has to be true. It's just we don't really have any reason to say definitively which one. But that doesn't mean that people don't sometimes will accept one or the other just as a starting assumption. So hard determinists do tend to start out accepting determinism, and they also believe that free will is incompatible with at least determinism. Right? They might think that free will is incompatible with more things than that, but they do think that free will is incompatible with determinism, and they accept determinism, and so that tends to mean that they think that there's no such thing really as free will. That is the quote-unquote hard determinist position. That's the name that it has come to have. And it's more that they're incompatibilists than that they're determinists. And I should also make something really clear at this point. It's not that they decided that they would have a view. So, for example, hard determinists don't think that free will is incompatible with determinism because they're hard determinists. They're hard determinists because they don't think free will is incompatible with determinism, right? So they have a view and they argue for it, and we put them into one or another of these categories based on the nature of the view that they actually think is correct. So the libertarian view, which is not to be confused with political libertarianism, that's an entirely different thing. The libertarian view in this context tends to start out accepting indeterminism. Again, they can't prove it, right? Because nobody could, but they tend to start out accepting indeterminism, and they tend to have the view that free will is incompatible with determinism, and compatible with indeterminism. Right? And that's how the compatibility question is often applied to the libertarian view. And then there are lots of different compatibilist views. Right? So if you say compatibilism generally, if again there are differences and there's a lot more variety in this camp than in libertarianism or hard determinism, but most compatibilists tend to start out accepting determinism and also believe that free will is compatible with at least determinism, right? Some believe that free will is compatible with determinism, but not indeterminism. Some believe it's compatible with both, but most compatibilists will start out, again, accepting determinism and believing that free will is compatible with it. It's at this point that I would like to address what I've labeled here as a sort of cringeworthy error. Right toward the beginning of the text, where it presents learning objectives, it presents learning objective 4.3, which reads as follows. This is just a quote from the textbook. Explain and critically evaluate compatibilism, comma, the view that attempts to find a common ground between hard determinism and indeterminism, parentheses, or libertarianism. Now that's pretty ambiguous here. Remember, hard determinism is not just a determinism, right? And libertarianism isn't just indeterminism. Both of those views also additionally contain views about what's compatible with what. Most especially whether free will is compatible with determinism or indeterminism or both or neither, etc. And so it seems like you could read this one of a couple of ways. You could either read it as saying that compatibilism attempts to find a common ground between determinism and indeterminism. And if that's the way you're going to read it, then this next bullet point applies. That's impossible. Okay, there is no logically possible common ground between determinism and indeterminism because either all events are caused or not all events are caused. There is not a third option. And so that is not what compatibilists are trying to do. And if anyone were trying to do that thing, they would have no luck, right? Because it's not logically possible. And so instead, if you want to read this as finding common ground between hard determinists and libertarians, okay, then both hard then that's already done, right? You don't need a third view for that. Both hard determinists and libertarians agree that free will is incompatible with determinism. It's just that hard determinists think that free will is incompatible with determinism and that determinism is true, and libertarians think that free will is incompatible with determinism, but that determinism is not true. So again, no third view would be necessary to supply that common ground. So I don't know what the idea here, but very often people will present compatibilism as a kind of way of saying that determinism is true and we have free will, and that's largely true, but it's not a middle ground between determinists and indeterminists because that's not possible, and it's not a middle ground between hard determinists and libertarians because that's not necessary. They both agree about the incompatibility of free will. It's its own view. It's a view that says that compatibilism is compatibilism is its own view. It's the view that says that free will is compatible with determinism mostly, or some other thing. Again, anytime somebody says compatibilism, you say compatibilism of what with what. All right, so enough of that. Let's continue on and say, all right, what is free will? That's the real issue here. So is free will the power to choose without being affected by factors beyond your control? Is free will the absence of any external constraining force? Is free will the absence of any external or internal constraining force? Or is free will a decision that is uncaused by any factor? Or is free will something else? Okay, one of the real issues with this debate is what is free will? What does that actually mean? And whatever we mean by it, is that thing then compatible if determinism were true or if indeterminism were true? Is it compatible with either of those separate concepts? So let's take a look at a variety of perspectives on what free will is and whether it is compatible with either determinism or indeterminism. Right. Let's start with the the perspective of Dolbach. That is the idea that free will is not compatible with determinism. Right, this is again something that somebody would call this a quote unquote hard determinist view, right? Because it starts out assuming something like assuming determinism is the case, and then provides a definition of free will and demonstrates that that definition does not really fit. It's not really compatible with the case, with determinism. And so this is what Dolbach says, and this is just a piece out of the very lengthy sections that are quoted in the text. I would definitely not skip over those. They're really fascinating, and Dolbach presents a very compelling case for why, no matter how much we feel like we could do all manner of things, really we could only do the thing that we're caused to do. That is, if you have some reason to do X instead of Y, you're going to do X, right? If you want A more than B, absent any other causal factors, you're going to do A. And he says that's fine, right? That feels maybe from the inside like free will, but if you look at it from a kind of bird's eye view, you're seeing that there's just causes all the way down. And so then there's no room for something like free will if free will requires there not to necessarily be causes. So listen to what he says. He says, meaning people, or a general person, right? Persons are born without their consent. Their organization does in no wise depend upon themselves. Their ideas come to them involuntarily. Their habits are in the power of those who cause them to contract them. They are unceasingly modified by causes, whether visible or concealed, over which they have no control, which necessarily regulate their mode of existence and give the hue to their way of thinking and determine their way of acting. People are good or bad, happy or miserable, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without their will being for anything in these various states. Nevertheless, in despite of the shackles by which we are bound, it is pretended that we are a free agent, or that independent of the causes by which we are moved, we determine our own will and regulate our own condition. Right? And so he says he thinks that this notion we have of free will is nothing other than a kind of illusion that's born of our very limited perspective. Right? All we get to see is sort of we get to see things only from our own limited point of view. And he says if we knew all of the myriads of causes and effects that were going on, at all times, well, we wouldn't be surprised that things couldn't really be otherwise. Things always turn out the way that they are caused to turn out. And so he thinks that if by free will you mean you can sort of change the course of causes and effects, midstream without, or something like that, he's like that doesn't happen, right? And again, he adopts this view for the most part out of a kind of scientific motive, although he's writing long enough ago that what we recognize as modern science is not really there yet, but some of the ideas that will eventually comprise it clearly are. And so that's one view, right? It's a view that seen a certain way, a certain concept of free will is really not compatible with a certain concept of determinism. But of course, we have to ask the other question as well. Is a certain view of free will compatible with indeterminism? And this is one that the textbook really ought to have gone into a lot of more depth about, but sort of leaves out. It's a major issue in the way that people argue about this, but it does seem to be left out of there. So I'd like to supply an illustration now to sort of explain what we mean by talking about the incompatibility of free will and indeterminism. And so consider this, right? Just imagine you're driving along and you see the car in front of you's brake lights turn on. Okay. Now, notice the reason that you can see their brake lights turn on and register that you've seen it is because light enters your eyes and hits your optic nerve and does a whole thing. Then your brain does a bunch of stuff with the signal that hits the optic nerve that causes you to realize, hey, there's brake lights in front of me. Now, in a sense, you don't really have a choice about that. You can't really choose not to see the brake lights. I mean, I guess you could close your eyes. You can choose not to see anything, but you can't selectively say, nope, just not gonna, all of that stuff happens automatically. The light hits your eyes, it gets focused automatically. That's not in your conscious control. Your optic nerve does what it does with whether you tell it to or not. And all that stuff happens more or less. Again, there's the chain of causes and effects, of course. And so the idea is that the brake lights in front of you have caused you to see that there's the car in front of you's brake lights are on. And that tends to cause you to have a belief, right? That is, it causes you to believe that you will hit that car if you don't brake. Right? That's great, right? Now imagine for other reasons, we're just going to sort of insert this one. Again, there's probably some other causal chain responsible for your having this desire, because they don't just come from nowhere, right? So the idea is that let's just assume you don't want to hit that car, right? That's a desire that you have. You have a desire not to hit that car in front of you, and so. See how that belief and that desire interact with each other. If you believe that you will hit that car if you don't brake, and you desire not to hit that car, well, it seems like there should be a decision incoming. That is, the decision to brake. Okay, so once you've made the decision to brake, it seems like what you want to do is you want that decision to cause something else. You want that decision to cause, nerve signals to travel, and you want those nerve signals to cause muscles to contract, and it'll cause your foot to move, and all that stuff will eventually end up in you, like all the nerve signals and all the muscle contractions and all that will end up you moving in a certain way and actually, depressing the brake pedal. And you hope that when you depress the brake pedal, that there's a set of linkages and mechanisms and all that sort of stuff that cause the brake calipers to clamp down on the brake disc. And as a result of how that's attached to your car, you want it to create enough friction with both the car and the tires with the road and all that stuff to stop the car. Okay. Well, now. Imagine that. So notice this is we've told a very causal picture here, a very determinist picture. Right? The idea is that, again, the brake lights cause you to see that the car, right, and the light hitting your eye causes you to see all this stuff, which causes the belief that you'll hit the car if you don't brake. And if you have the desire not to hit the car, then you make a decision to brake, and that decision causes nerve signals and muscle contractions that cause your body parts to move, that cause you to push on a device that causes this, that causes that, that causes the brakes to clamp down, that causes, etc. Right? And the car comes to a stop. And that whole thing sounds great. And my question is then, if you want to make room for, if you think that free will requires some kind of break in the causal chain, where? And if there are breaks in the causal chain, does that look like free will in any sense? Right? So let's try it at each step here. All right, and I'm going to get my little laser pointer out to be clear. So let's say, okay, now imagine that the light hitting your eyes just does not cause any signals to happen. You just don't see the car. Sometimes, right? Some events are just not caused. The light hits your eyes, but it just doesn't do anything when it hits it. Or the light gets processed, hits the optic nerve, but the optic nerve just doesn't do anything when it gets. I mean, just again, causality takes a little tiny holiday. And then you hit the car, right? And you said, yes, I hit the car of my own free will. Really? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, well, let's move on. Okay, now, all right, you're seeing, right, the light from the brakes and all that other stuff. So all that light hitting your eyes causes you to believe that you'll hit the car if you don't brake. Okay, well, now assume that like seeing all that stuff didn't cause you to have that belief, and then you hit the car in front of you. Now, do you say, yep, I hit the car of my own free will. Causality took a holiday here, in between seeing the light and forming some belief about it. It's like, well, that sounds like more like a malfunction than it sounds like free will. And so again, let's do it. So again, if you move here, so you have a belief, right, that you'll hit the car if you don't brake, and you have a desire not to hit the car, right? Shouldn't that cause you to make the decision to brake? Right? Again, now imagine causality takes a holiday at that step, right, where things don't necessarily happen for a reason, and you just like hit the car. Right? It's like, again, it's like, no, I hit the car of my own free will. Does that sound like free will, or does that sound like a malfunction? So again, you say, no, I decided to brake. It's just that causality took a holiday, and I didn't happen to, the nerve signals just didn't go out. Right? Or the nerve signals went out, but like muscles just didn't contract, right? I just didn't move, right? I decided to do all that, I just didn't, right? So yeah, I hit the car of my own free will, right? Is that free will or is that a malfunction? And again, I think you can just see, like, certainly once we get to here, we say, no, I stepped on the brake pedal and like the car didn't stop, right? That's a malfunction, right? Especially if it happens just because causality takes a holiday, not because the brakes are broken. If the brakes are broken, there's some reason they are caused to be broken. There's something that they're not actually doing that they would otherwise do. There's a cause to the malfunction in that case. But again, none of that sounds like, so if you hit the car in front of you because of any of those reasons, because of causality just taking a holiday, that doesn't sound like free will in any of those cases. And so this is the kind of illustration that illustrates that free will, if you want to just assume that free will is compatible with indeterminism, you've got a lot of work to do. Why should every now and then something happening for no reason at all mean free will? Because when you put it this way, like it sounds again more like a malfunction than free will. Again, seems like you're responsible for something that you do while having a reason to do that thing, whereas things that happen for literally no reason whatsoever, I don't know that anyone seems responsible for those things, or like that really implicates what we're after in free will. So again, I think the text should spend a lot more time on this issue. It's certainly an important issue, and it's one of the big parts of the free will determinism debate, is whether free will is even compatible with indeterminism, much less requiring it, as some libertarians would say. So I'm going to keep this here just for a couple of seconds here. Again, some of the key questions you should ask given the illustration we just went through before are: number one, where in the process should causality break down? And if it does, is that free will? Also, why should the universe care? This is something I guess I could have also mentioned. Why should the universe care whether human beings or brake calipers are causing something? Right? So when we think about the car, like every single time you push on that brake pedal to have the calipers, squeeze the brake disc. I mean, we want that to happen every single time without fail, deterministically. Okay, but so why do we want a universe where brakes work that way, but our brains don't, or our eyes don't, or our feet don't, or something like that? And that's something sort of mysterious. And also, outside of a determinist framework, is there a way of describing free will as something other than magic? And this is one of the things that people worry about, who think that free will might not even be compatible with indeterminism, or they worry about somebody having the view that indeterminism is required for free will to be a thing. Because if that's the case, well, then you're saying, you're saying that human action is in some ways just magic, right? And why should it just be human action that gets to take a break from the laws of causality, and not not cars or brakes or anything else? It's a little strange. And again, you got a lot of work to do to have that sort of a view. All right, so let's move into then some compatibilist understandings of free will. And so we'll start with, say, Hobart's position and what are called alternate possibilities. And this is, again, just a quote from the text from Hobart. And Hobart writes as follows. He says, "The thesis of this article is that there has never been any ground for the controversy between the doctrine of free will and determinism, that it is based on a misapprehension, that the two assertions are entirely consistent, and that one of them strictly implies the other, that they have been opposed only because of our natural want of analytical imagination. In saying so, I do not tamper with the meaning of either phrase." Okay, let's highlight that for a minute, and we'll come back there. "That would be unpardonable," he says. This is great. He says, "I mean free will in the natural and usual sense, in the fullest, most absolute sense in which, for the purposes of the personal and moral life, the term is ever employed. I mean it as implying responsibility, merit and demerit, guilt and desert. I mean it as implying that after an act has been performed," this is his definition here of free will, "after an act has been performed, that one, quote, could have done otherwise than one did." Right? Now, of course, that takes some unpacking. And one of the things that you'll notice about determinists, compatibilist determinists, is that they will very often say that they are using the only reasonable definition of free will that exists. Okay, when really what they're doing is they're using a different definition of free will than most incompatibilists use. And now whether there's the more quote unquote natural view or not, that's neither here nor there. But it's very clear that oftentimes compatibilists will use a different definition of the term free will than incompatibilists, and that tends to make all the difference. But here, again, Hobart provides us this definition, right? He says, again, after an act has been performed, one could have done otherwise than one did. Now, that requires a little bit of unpacking. Now, does he mean that? Because read one way, you could say, well, that looks like free will requires indeterminism. It requires, like, again, so imagine you let some set of events play out, right? And everything gets caused the way it gets caused. And imagine that you were to then rewind the universe, for a couple hours and then replay it, right? So if something different was going to happen, well, that would be a non-determinist system, right? Where you're leaving all the causes intact and yet all of a sudden something different happens given the same causes. That's indeterminism, right? Whereas a determinist would tend to say in a very strict sense that you really couldn't have done otherwise than you did. Except that most compatibilists mean that in a more figurative way. So, for example, you might say, it's like, well, gosh, if I had just, squared my feet up a little bit more than I did, I could have made that shot that I missed, right? If you're in a basketball game or something, and that's to some extent true. The idea is that, yes, if your feet were in a little different place, or if you had kind of gone through a slightly different body motion, then yes, the ball would have flown differently. And so basically the idea is if the causes were so subtly different, we might have gotten a different result. That's compatible. You can say both of those things, right? And so if that's what somebody means by free will, well, then that is totally compatible with determinism, with saying, like, well, look, had the causal situation before I acted been just a little bit different than it was, well, then what would have happened would have been something entirely different. And, that's true. But, then there's a question as to whether that really counts as free will. I want to talk a little more about this idea of alternate possibilities, though. And one of the things I want to bring in that, again, I really do wish the text brought these in at this point because they're really fun. But I'll just go ahead and bring it in here. Frankfurt-Style Counterexamples. And these are from the 20th century philosopher. I'm actually pretty sure he's still alive. A guy named Harry Frankfurt, who's became famous for these sorts of things, who purports to show that our concept of free will does not actually even require that we were able to do otherwise than we did. That is, we feel like people can do things of their own free will, even if there were not alternate possibilities, even if they couldn't have done otherwise. And so one famous example that Frankfurt himself provides is quoted here. So here's the counterexample. Black is a nefarious neurosurgeon. In performing an operation on Jones to remove a brain tumor, Black inserts a mechanism into Jones's brain which enables Black to monitor and control Jones's activities. Jones, meanwhile, knows nothing of this. Black exercises this control through a computer which he has programmed so that, among other things, it monitors Jones's voting behavior. If Jones shows an inclination to decide to vote for the Democrat, then the computer, through the mechanism in Jones's brain, intervenes to assure that he actually decides to vote for the Republican, and does so vote. But if Jones decides on his own to vote for the Republican, the computer does nothing but continue to monitor without affecting the goings-on in Jones's head. Suppose Jones decides to vote for the Republican on his own, just as he would have if Black had not inserted the mechanism into his head. Then Frankfurt claims that Jones is responsible, right, for voting for the Republican, regardless of the fact they could not have done otherwise. Sorry, the second, there actually should be end quotes here, and the second paragraph is a bit of a descriptor of this earlier. This is this is the example, and then this is a little bit about the example. Sorry. But yeah, so the idea is that Jones is responsible for voting as he did, regardless of the fact that he could not have done otherwise. And so examples like these ones, one more that I remember that is sort of famous is, imagine that you're in a locked room and you are trying to decide whether you want to sort of go out for dinner or whether you want to just stay in and read. And you decide to stay in and read, but unknown to you, the door was locked from the outside and you couldn't have left even if you had wanted to. The fact is, you can still freely have chosen to stay in, even though you could not have done otherwise, right? So they're really fun little examples that maybe they say something about what's compatible with what, and maybe they don't. But it does seem to indicate that perhaps we can make sense of free will, even if the alternate possibilities are not genuine. That is, you couldn't really have done something different than you were caused to do, but you still decided to do it of your own free will. It's a very interesting set of counterexamples, and it's a really fascinating thought. All right, let's talk next about some compatibilist understandings of free will that include Stace and internal causes. These are, again, quoted at length in your text. And so Stace puts it this way. He says, "It is clear that all those actions of persons which we should ordinarily attribute to the exercise of their free will, or of which we should say that they freely choose to do them, are in fact actions which have been caused by their own desires, wishes, thoughts, emotions, impulses, or other psychological states." Okay, and this is going to be Stace's definition of free will. Right? He's notice that's different than Hobart's definition, even though they are both compatibilists. Right? And so the definition is actions which have been caused by their own desires, wishes, thoughts, emotions, impulses, or other psychological states. Right? So that's another way of defining free will, and that's another way of defining it in a way that it is compatible with determinism. So it's possible that our desires and wishes, etc., do cause us to do as we do, but as long as those are the things that are causing us to do as we do, as opposed to somebody chaining us up or something like that, then we have free will. Then that's all that is. Right? So that's a reasonable definition of free will, just as the others have been, but it's one that is in fact compatible with determinism. Consider here a definition from David Hume, who's another somebody who's called a compatibilist, right? And so he says this. So he says, "For what is meant by liberty," it's a synonym for freedom, "when applied to voluntary actions, we cannot surely mean that actions have so little connection with motives, inclinations, and circumstances that one does not follow with a certain degree of uniformity from the other, and that one affords to inference by which we can conclude the existence of the other." So I'm going to pause here for a second. Notice in that first part of there, Hume is suggesting that free will is not compatible with indeterminism. He says, look, we have to admit that our own motives, our inclinations, another word for desires, and our circumstances have like everything, they have a pretty reliable impact on what we do, right? Those are the things that cause us to do as we do. And he says that, and when somebody does something, you can tell why they did it, right? You can tell what their motives are, you can tell what their desires are by how they behave. And so he continues. "For these are plain and acknowledged matters of fact. By liberty, then, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Here, then, there is no subject of dispute." It's another thing you sometimes see compatibilists and other philosophers say. There's like, well, there's no dispute about this, right? Of course, that's exactly what the dispute about is to whether that's really what free will means. And so someone might say, so Hume here appears to be defining free will as the absence of some kind of external constraint. Right? And if that's what free will means, it seems very clear that's also compatible with a deterministic worldview. It seems also that should be compatible with an indeterministic worldview, although here Hume thinks indeterministic worldviews are sort of senseless, right? Because he's like, well, then you're saying stuff happens for no reason, including human actions. Why? What sense does that make? How is that something that we would otherwise want? All right, let's continue. In addition to thinking about freedom from external constraint, consider some compatibilist understandings of free will that include internal constraints. So this is Moritz Schlick is again summarized in the textbook. And Schlick has this view that if a person is chained up, then they are unfree. I think pretty much everyone agrees with that. However, Schlick also thinks that at least some internal causes are the equivalent of chains. And he's thinking of the kind of compulsions that are associated with very serious mental illnesses or addictions or something like that. And that's plausible, right? I mean, that makes some sense. But it does raise some very difficult questions of how to account for the difference between an ordinary desire that reliably causes an act, and which makes it an act of free will, and some psychological compulsion that reliably causes the act, but which makes the act not an act of free will. Okay, so for example, when I want a taco more than a hamburger, I would go to Taco Bell, right? But if I just had this compulsion to go to Taco Bell, I would go to Taco Bell. So again, what's the difference between one of those things seeming like it's a free act and the other not being a free act, except for using the word compulsion, right? So it's very interesting. There's a lot of very interesting work to do, and I hope you can see sort of the ambiguity of that position, and how much work needs to be done to really fully flesh it out. So one of the final things that our text mentions as a kind of compatibilist worldview or a compatibilist understanding of free will is Daniel Dennett's. And they mention Dennett's view as being sort of an evolutionary view. And I'll just briefly mention that his view comes from two books, a book called Elbow Room, which was the first of the two published, and then a book that was published a while later called Freedom Evolves. And I think both are worth reading if you're interested in the free will determinism debate, because I think they're really unique. And the text says that Dennett's position is very, very hard to summarize, and that's true. That's if you could summarize it, he wouldn't have written two books about it. Instead, he would have written 2 paragraphs about it if that was all that was needed, but it isn't, and so he didn't, and so there they are. So in general, Dennett's view is that human action is not in any way independent of natural law. He thinks there's no such thing as magic, right, in that sense. And the feeling that our acts are free, there's our free choices, might be a kind of necessary illusion to allow us to deal with the very complex network of causes that exist between ourselves and our environment, including other choosers. And so instead of summarizing his view myself, I've included a guest lecture, a very short piece of an interview with Dennett where he does something to try and explain his own view of the compatibility of free will with determinism. And so now we can go to some incompatibilist understanding, some views that say that free will is in fact not compatible with determinism. And the first of those is the concept of transcendental freedom given to us by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he writes as follows. He says, "This may imply psychological freedom if we choose to apply this term to a merely internal chain of ideas in the mind. But it involves physical necessity and therefore leave no room for transcendental freedom, which must be conceived as independence on everything empirical and consequently on nature generally, whether it is an object of the internal sense considered in time only, or of the external in time and space." And if you think that that's not particularly clear, well, you're not alone. Kant is possibly the worst writer in the history of writing, but his ideas are so important that we continue to deal with his really crappy and unclear writing style because his ideas really are pretty rich and important. So in a sense, though, if you sort of parse this out slowly enough, you'll see that what he's saying is he says, no, free will is an independence on nature generally. I think let's just highlight that. Okay, so an independence on everything empirical and consequently on nature generally. Okay, so he says that freedom is not, it's things not being caused necessarily. Right, that's really what he thinks. So if that's what you think that free will is, well, then of course free will is not compatible with determinism. Right. So if the idea that freedom requires things not to be caused, and determinism says everything is caused, well, then of course the two views are not compatible. And so that's the case. Now, you might wonder, is there a good reason for thinking that free will means that things can't be caused? Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but certainly that's the work you'd have to do to maintain this view. And so finally, let's take a look at another indeterminist understanding of free will that is William James's view of that heavily involves moral responsibility. And this is probably the most lengthy of the quotes I'm going to take out of the text here, but again, James is quoted pretty extensively, and I think it's worth paying some close attention here to see what's going on. James writes this. He says, "But for the deterministic philosophy, the murderer, the sentence, and the prisoner's optimism were all necessary for maternity. Nothing else for a moment had a ghost of a chance of being put into their place. To admit such a chance, the determinists tell us, would be to make a suicide of reason. So we must steel our hearts against the thought. And here our plot thickens, for we see the first of those difficult implications of determinism and monism which is my purpose to make you feel. If this Brockton murder was called for by the rest of the universe, if it had come at its pre-appointed hour, and if nothing else would have been consistent with the sense of the whole, what are we to think of the universe? Are we stubbornly to stick our judgment of regret and say, though it couldn't be, yet it would have been a better universe with something different from this Brockton murder in it? That, of course, seems the natural and spontaneous thing for us to do, and yet it is nothing short of deliberately espousing a kind of pessimism. The judgment of regret calls the murder bad. Calling a thing bad means, if anything at all, that the thing ought not to be, that something else ought to be in its stead. Determinism, in denying that anything else can be in its stead, virtually defines the universe as a place in which what ought to be is impossible. In other words, as an organism whose constitution is affected with an incurable taint, an irremediable flaw. I see no escape whatever from this pessimistic conclusion if, being determinists, our judgment of regret is allowed to stand at all. So again, that takes a lot of unpacking, and it takes a very slow and careful read, because these are difficult issues to begin with. There's no way to make a really, really complicated and hairy philosophical issue easy to read about or write about. It's just not going to happen. But James does as well as anybody. So let's pay attention mostly to the second half of this quotation here. So here he says, calling a thing bad means that the thing ought not to be. Right, that something else should be its case. Right, so that's the sort of point one. That seems fine. I think we can let that stand. Determinism, he says, in denying that anything else can be in its stead, virtually defines the universe as a place in which what ought to be is impossible. Okay. Well, again, I think he's right about that, right? So the idea is if things have been caused to be a certain way, then they couldn't really have been otherwise without the causes having been different, right? And so the idea is if somebody was caused to murder somebody, and we say that shouldn't have happened, right? We say it would have been certainly better had they not been, but because determinism is the case, they really were caused to murder that person. So he says if that's the case, right, then what we have to do is we have this pessimism, right? He says we'd have to say that the universe just contains some of these things that are bad, and we can't do anything about it, and we couldn't have done it, or we certainly can't do anything yeah, this idea that we can't do anything about it, that requires some unpacking. I mean, because again, one of the things we can do is we can meddle, right? And we can be caused to meddle in the causal nexus. I mean, we're all interconnected things. There's not just one little. It's not like dominoes or something like that, where there's one little cause for everything. Lots of things are caused by lots of things. But in any case, his argument seems to be that if we were to accept determinism, we would have to accept bad things that we couldn't do anything about. And it seems like you could go two ways with that. You say, "Oh, that seems sort of awful," but the fact that you might not want that to be true doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. And that's where his argument is very, very peculiar. That it does seem like he's arguing that because it would be frustrating to us for determinism to be true, that it can't be. Which I hope you see that that's not a great argument, but that really does sort of appear to be what he is arguing here. But we can interpret it a little bit more charitably. We can say something like this. We can say, look, if moral responsibility, right, requires things to have happened one way or another, right, if it requires some sort of genuine alternate possibility, and if moral responsibility requires free will, then that's an understanding of free will that really would be incompatible with determinism. Certainly, I think we can say that that is the case, and that he would be right about that. Okay, that if that is the right definition of free will, then that definition would be incompatible with determinism. And so you've seen a lot of different ideas about what free will is and about whether it is compatible or incompatible with determinism or indeterminism. And so to summarize everything here, the main issue in the unit is what the term free will really means, right? That's the issue on which turns all of the rest of the dispute, right? What does it mean? Once you settle on a definition of free will, well, then it seems to be, it's often fairly obviously either compatible or incompatible with determinism or indeterminism. But it's settling on that definition that's really difficult, because it seems like we might plausibly mean lots of different things by free will, and the examples do kind of all make sense, and so that's why it's such a difficult topic. And so another thing we can say in summary here is that any concept of free will that is incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism is incoherent, right? And we should just discard it, right? So that's certainly something that we can make progress with. So if some particular idea of free will isn't compatible with determinism and also isn't compatible with indeterminism, well, then we got to throw it away, because one of those two things is the case. Some concepts of free will are compatible with both determinism and indeterminism. That happens, while some are compatible with only one of them. And you've seen sort of a variety of each of those. And finally, there's lots of different views that are collectively referred to as compatibilist views, and it's really useful to track all the differences between them. Not all compatibilists agree about what free will is, and whether it's compatible with determinism and indeterminism, or whether it's compatible with only determinism, right? Traditionally, most compatibilists accept determinism and also think that free will is compatible with determinism, but there are other kinds of compatibilism that still say there's something that's compatible with something else.